The thermometer outside Mikhail Novak's shack read -37 degrees, but inside, he slept without shivering for the first time in 3 Dakota Territory winters. The brick walls his neighbors had mocked all summer were now 41 degrees warmer than their own cabins, and by morning they would come asking how he had done it. Before we get into how Mikhail changed frontier construction forever, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if stories about forgotten innovations interest you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. The Novak brothers filed their homestead claim in the spring of 1881 on 160 acres of Dakota Territory grassland that stretched flat and featureless to every horizon. Mikhail was 28 years old. Jakob was 25, and neither had experience farming or building. But the Homestead Act required only that they improve the land and live on it for 5 years. The land was free. The survival was not guaranteed. They arrived with 2 horses, a wagon loaded with supplies purchased in Yankton, and plans drawn from optimism rather than experience. The nearest neighbor was Anton Kowalski, whose claim sat 3 miles to the east. The nearest town was 11 miles south, a collection of buildings too small to deserve the name, but large enough to have a general store and a land office. The brothers were not alone on the prairie, but they were alone enough that mistakes would be theirs to survive. Their first task was shelter. They had arrived too late in the season to plant crops, so they focused on building a structure that would protect them through their first winter. Neither brother knew proper carpentry. Their father had been a tailor in Prague before emigrating to America, and the skills they possessed came from watching other men work rather than from apprenticeship or training. They built what they could manage with the skills they had. The shack took them 9 days to construct. It measured 12 feet by 14 feet, with walls made from cottonwood logs they cut from a creek bed 2 miles away. The logs were roughly shaped, notched at the corners, using a technique Mikhail had seen another homesteader demonstrate, and chinked with prairie sod mixed with clay from the creek bank. The roof was sod laid over cottonwood poles. The door was planks held together with leather hinges. There was 1 small window covered with oiled paper. The floor was packed dirt. The structure was primitive by any standard, but it was typical of first-year homestead construction across the territory. Homesteaders built simple shelters their first season, then improved them over subsequent years as time and resources allowed. The Novak brothers' shack was weather-tight enough to keep out rain. It had a fireplace built from prairie stone and clay mortar. It would serve its purpose, or so they believed. They spent the summer and autumn proving their claim. They broke 40 acres of sod using a borrowed plow and their 2 horses. They planted nothing that first year, simply prepared the ground for the following spring. They dug a well that reached water at 18 feet. They built a small stable for the horses. They hauled firewood from the creek and stacked it against the north wall of the shack. By November, they had accomplished what the land office required and prepared for winter as best they understood how. The first snows came in early December. The brothers settled into a routine of maintaining their animals, keeping the fire burning, and waiting for spring. The blizzard arrived on January 9, 1882, announced by a temperature drop of 40 degrees in less than 6 hours. Mikhail noticed the change while checking the horses in the afternoon. The wind shifted from south to north, the sky turned the color of old iron, and the air carried a smell like cold metal. He told Jakob they needed to secure everything and prepare to stay inside for several days. They brought extra firewood into the shack, stacking it along the interior walls where it would stay dry. They filled every container with water from the well. They moved the horses into the stable and gave them extra feed. They checked the chinkling between the logs, pushing additional clay and sod into gaps they found. By evening, the snow had started, and by full dark, the wind was strong enough to shake the shack's walls. The brothers took turns maintaining the fire through the night. The fireplace drew poorly in high wind, smoking into the room whenever gusts hit from certain directions. The temperature inside the shack dropped steadily despite the fire. Cold air came through gaps they had not found during their inspection, through the window covering, under the door, between logs where the chinking had dried and cracked. They hung blankets across the interior, creating a smaller space around the fireplace to concentrate what heat they could generate. By the second night, both brothers were exhausted from cold and poor sleep. The fire consumed wood faster than they had anticipated. Their stacked supply, which they had thought sufficient for a week, would last perhaps 4 days at this rate. Jakob suggested letting the fire burn lower through the night to conserve fuel. They could pile on extra blankets and maintain a smaller fire that would last until morning. Mikkel was not certain this was wise, but Jakob was insistent, and Mikael was too tired to argue. They built up the fire at dusk and let it burn down to coals by 10 o'clock. They wrapped themselves in every blanket they owned and lay down to sleep. The temperature inside the shack dropped quickly once the flames died. Cold seeped up from the dirt floor, down from the sod roof, through the walls from every direction. Mikael woke several times, shivering, and considered rebuilding the fire, but each time he looked over at Jakob sleeping and decided to let his brother rest. When Mikael woke on the morning of January 11th, the fire was completely dead, and Jakob was not breathing. His brother had frozen to death sometime in the early morning hours. The temperature inside the shack was below zero. Outside, the blizzard continued with no sign of breaking. Mikael rebuilt the fire with hands that shook from cold and shock. But there was nothing the heat could do for Jakob now. Mikael wrapped Jakob's body in blankets and placed it in the stable, where the cold would preserve it until the ground thawed enough for burial. The blizzard lasted 3 more days. Mikael sat alone in the shack, keeping the fire burning, and thought about what had killed his brother. The answer seemed obvious at first. Jakob had frozen because the fire went out. But the more Mikael considered it, the more he realized that answer was incomplete. The fire had not gone out by accident. They had let it die intentionally to conserve fuel. They had made that choice because keeping the shack warm required burning wood at an unsustainable rate. The real question was not why the fire went out, but why the shack lost heat so quickly that a few hours without flames turned the interior deadly. Mikael had spent enough time in buildings in town to know that structures could hold heat longer than his shack did. The question was why. He began paying attention to how the shack behaved. When he built up the fire, the air warmed quickly, but the walls remained cold to the touch. When the fire burned down, the warmth disappeared within an hour, as if the heat simply passed through the walls and vanished into the prairie wind. The structure provided no resistance to the cold. It was a box that separated him from direct wind, but did nothing to hold the heat he generated. After the blizzard passed, Mikael buried Jakob on a rise a quarter-mile from the shack. He piled stones over the grave to mark it and stood there until his hands went numb from cold. He did not pray. He simply made a silent promise that he would understand what had failed and how to prevent it from failing again. Jakob's death would not be repeated. When Mikael returned to the shack, he began examining other homesteaders' structures. Anton Kowalski's cabin was larger but built using the same methods. Stefan Kovacs, whose claim was 4 miles west, had a similar structure. Every homesteader Mikael visited lived in variations of the same design: log walls, sod roofs, fireplaces that consumed enormous amounts of wood and provided heat that vanished the moment the fire diminished. Everyone accepted this as normal. Winter was cold, fires needed constant feeding, and nights were miserable. Homesteaders layered clothing, buried themselves in blankets, and survived until spring. Some did not survive. Jakob was not the first to freeze, and he would not be the last. But Mikael could not accept this as inevitable. There had to be a better method, and he intended to find it. Mikael rode to town. In late January, ostensibly to file paperwork regarding Jakob's death and to purchase supplies. But his real purpose was to study buildings. The town consisted of perhaps 20 structures: a general store, a land office, a hotel, a livery stable, a church, and various residences and commercial buildings. Most were wood-frame construction typical of frontier towns, but 3 buildings were built from brick, and those 3 buildings interested Mikhail intensely. The general store was brick, the land office was brick, the hotel was brick. Mikhail noticed that these buildings required far less heating than comparable wooden structures. The general store had a small stove in one corner that burned modestly throughout the day. The hotel's lobby, which was larger than most homesteaders' entire cabins, stayed comfortable with a single fireplace. The land office was warm enough that the clerk worked without a coat, despite temperatures outside being well below freezing. Mikhail spent 2 days in town, and during that time he paid attention to details other men ignored. He observed that the brick buildings did not just stay warmer, they stayed warm longer. The general store's stove was allowed to burn down at night, yet when the store opened in the morning, the interior was still tolerably warm. The hotel's fireplace was maintained through the evening, but reduced overnight, and guests did not complain of cold rooms. The wooden buildings, by contrast, turned frigid within hours of their fires diminishing. He asked the store owner about heating costs. The man told him that he burned approximately 1 cord of wood per month during winter. Mikhail calculated that his shack, which was 1/3 the size of the store, had consumed nearly that much wood in the 2 weeks of January's coldest weather. The disparity was remarkable. The brick building was larger, yet required far less fuel to maintain comfortable temperature. Mikhail began asking questions about how brick buildings were constructed. The hotel owner explained that the walls were 2 bricks thick, meaning each wall was roughly 8 inches of solid brick. The general store owner mentioned that his building stayed warm because brick held heat, though he could not explain exactly what that meant. A carpenter who was repairing a door frame at the land office told Mikhail that masonry construction was superior to wood for temperature control, but most homesteaders could not afford brick. That statement caught Mikhail's attention. Could not afford brick, or did not know how to make it? He knew bricks were manufactured, but he had assumed they required specialized equipment and skills. The carpenter laughed and told him that bricks were simply clay-shaped and fired. Any man with clay and a fire could make bricks. The quality might vary, but serviceable bricks required no special knowledge beyond basic technique. Michael found a bricklayer named Henry Cochran working on a chimney repair at the hotel. Cochran was a lean man in his 50s who had learned masonry in Pennsylvania before moving west. Mikhail offered to buy him dinner in exchange for information about brick construction. Cochran accepted, and over a meal of fried pork and potatoes, Mikhail received an education in principles he had never considered. Cochran explained that wood and brick behaved differently when exposed to heat. Wood was light and porous. It warmed quickly but held no heat. When you heated a wooden building, you were warming the air inside, not the structure itself. The moment the heat source diminished, the warm air escaped through gaps and cracks, and the cold returned. Brick was different. Brick was dense and heavy. It absorbed heat slowly, but once warm, it released that heat gradually over many hours. This concept, which Cochran called thermal mass, was the key to understanding why brick buildings stayed warm with less fuel. During the day, when the fire burned steadily, the brick walls absorbed heat. At night, when the fire was reduced, the walls released that stored heat back into the room, maintaining temperature far longer than wooden walls ever could. The building itself became a heat reservoir that supplemented whatever fire you maintained. Mikhail asked how thick walls needed to be for this effect to work. Cochran told him that single brick walls provided some benefit, but double brick walls were significantly better. The more thermal mass you had, the more heat you could store, and the longer the release period lasted. A building with sufficient thermal mass could maintain comfortable temperature overnight, with minimal fire, sometimes with no fire at all if the day had been warm enough. The conversation shifted to construction techniques. Cochran described how bricks were laid with mortar, how corners were built to interlock courses, how openings for doors and windows required lintels to support the weight above. Mika listened carefully, asking questions about details that seemed relevant to his situation. He asked whether brick walls could be built against existing wooden structures. Cochran said it was possible, though unconventional. The brick would need proper foundation, and the courses would need to be plumb, but there was no structural reason it could not be done. Mikhail asked about making bricks without a kiln. Cochran explained that proper bricks required firing at high temperature in a controlled kiln, but acceptable bricks could be made using a field firing method where bricks were stacked in a large pile with fuel layered between them, and the entire mass was burned for several days. The quality would be inconsistent, and some bricks would be underfired or overfired, but enough would be usable for construction. When Mikhail left the hotel that evening, he had a plan forming in his mind. He could not afford to buy bricks, but he could make them. He could not build an entirely new structure, but he could build brick walls around his existing shack. Michael returned to his homestead in early February with specific knowledge and a plan that would consume the next 8 months of his life. He knew other homesteaders would consider his idea strange, possibly wasteful. But he no longer cared about conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom had killed Jakob. Miko would build something different, and if it worked, others could adopt it or not as they chose. The first challenge was clay. Bricks required large quantities of good clay, and Mikhail needed to locate a reliable source on or near his claim. He spent a week exploring the creek bed where he had cut logs the previous year. Most of the exposed soil was sandy or silty, unsuitable for brick making. But 2 miles upstream, where the creek cut through a low bluff, he found a thick seam of gray clay exposed in the bank. He dug out a sample and worked it in his hands. It was plastic and sticky, holding its shape well. He formed a crude brick and let it dry on his fireplace hearth for 3 days. When dry, it was hard and showed no major cracking. He made several more test bricks, experimenting with mixing the clay with sand to reduce shrinkage. Pure clay cracked badly during drying. Clay mixed with approximately 1 part sand to 3 parts clay dried with minimal cracking and produced a harder, finished brick. He fired one of his test bricks in the fireplace, burying it in coals overnight. When he extracted it the next morning, it had hardened further and produced a solid ringing sound when struck. The test was successful enough to proceed. The next challenge was tools and forms. Mikhail had a shovel and an axe, but he needed something to shape consistent bricks. He spent 2 days constructing a simple wooden mold from scrap planks, creating a rectangular form measuring 9 inches long, 4 inches wide, and 3 inches deep. The dimensions were arbitrary, based on what seemed manageable to handle and lay. He built 6 identical molds so he could produce multiple bricks simultaneously. By mid-February, he was ready to begin serious production. The ground was still frozen, but the clay seam was accessible enough that he could dig with effort. He hauled clay to his shack using his wagon, piling it near the structure where he would work it. He set up a mixing area where he could combine clay with sand and water, working the mixture with his hands and feet until it reached proper consistency. The process was labor-intensive and tedious. He would dig clay, haul it to the mixing area, blend it with sand and water, pack it into molds, turn the formed bricks out onto flat ground to dry, and repeat. Each brick took minutes to form but required days to dry before it could be fired. Mikhail worked steadily through late winter and into early spring, producing bricks whenever weather permitted. By April, he had approximately 800 bricks dried and stacked, waiting for firing. His neighbors began noticing the strange piles of sun-dried clay blocks accumulating near his shack, and questions started. Anton Kowalski rode over on a mild April afternoon and asked Mikhail what he was doing with all those clay blocks. Mikhail explained he was making bricks to build walls around his shack. Anton stared at him for a long moment, then asked why anyone would build brick walls around a perfectly functional wooden structure. Mikhail said he was improving the shack's ability to hold heat. Anton said that was the stupidest idea he had heard since arriving in Dakota Territory, and rode away, shaking his head. The conversation bothered Mikhail less than it might have before Jakob's death. He knew what he was doing appeared irrational to men who had not studied thermal mass or thought carefully about heat retention. Anton would understand after the first winter, or he would not. Either way, Mikhail would be warm, and that was what mattered. The field firing was the most anxious part of the process. Mikhail had 800 dried bricks and limited fuel to fire them. He built a large rectangular pile, stacking bricks with gaps between them and layering dry cottonwood branches throughout the structure. The pile measured roughly 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 5 feet tall. He covered the entire assembly with a thick layer of clay mixed with prairie grass, creating a crude kiln that would hold heat while allowing smoke to escape. He lit the fire on April 20th and maintained it for 4 days, feeding fuel through openings at the base of the pile. The clay covering cracked in places from the heat, and he patched those cracks with fresh clay. Smoke poured from the top of the pile continuously. The heat was intense enough that he could not approach within 5 feet of the structure. On the 4th day, he stopped feeding fuel and let the fire burn down naturally. The pile cooled for 3 more days before he carefully dismantled it. The results were mixed but acceptable. Approximately 200 bricks were overfired, darkened to nearly black and showing some warping. Another 100 were underfired, remaining pale and soft enough that he could scratch them with his fingernail. The remaining 500 bricks were properly hardened, ringing clearly when struck and showing good color ranging from orange to deep red, depending on their position in the firing pile. 500 bricks would not be sufficient for his project. Mikhail calculated he would need at least 2,000 bricks to build walls around his shack to any meaningful height. He had made 1 firing's worth in 2 months. He would need 3 more firings to accumulate enough bricks, which meant continuing production through the summer. The work was exhausting and time-consuming, but he saw no alternative if he wanted to survive the next winter in conditions better than those that had killed Jacob. He started his second batch of bricks in early May, working the clay beds harder and producing more bricks per day as his technique improved. By mid-May, he had another 800 bricks drying. Mikhail fired his second batch in early June and his third batch in mid-July. By August, he had accumulated approximately 1,500 usable bricks of varying quality. It was fewer than he had hoped for, but possibly sufficient if he built carefully. He decided to begin construction and make additional bricks if he ran short. The summer was passing, and he needed walls completed before cold weather returned. He started on the south wall of his shack, the side that received the most direct sunlight and would be easiest to work. He dug a shallow trench approximately 6 inches deep and 12 inches wide around the shack's perimeter, exposing the base logs. He filled this trench with stones gathered from the creek bed, creating a rough foundation that would keep the brick courses level and prevent settling. It was not sophisticated engineering, but it was better than building directly on prairie soil. His first course of bricks went down slowly. He mixed mortar from clay, sand, and water, creating a thick paste that he spread between bricks. Each brick had to be placed level, checked with a straight edge he had fashioned from a plank, and tapped into position. The work required patience and precision he had never needed for any previous task. He laid approximately 30 bricks the first day, completing just 10 feet of the south wall's first course. The south wall measured 14 feet long. Each course required approximately 42 bricks. Mikhail planned to build the walls to a height of 6 feet, which would require roughly 24 courses. That meant just over 1,000 bricks for the south wall alone. He had 4 walls to build. The mathematics were discouraging, but he continued working. By late August, the south wall stood 3 feet high, and neighbors began visiting specifically to criticize. Anton Kowalski brought 2 other homesteaders, men Mikhail knew only by sight, and all 3 stood staring at the half-built brick wall against the wooden shack. One of them asked if Mikhail understood he was building a brick house around a wooden house. Mikhail said he understood exactly what he was building. The man said it was the most backward construction he had ever seen, and that Mikhail was wasting time that should be spent on productive work. Stefan Kovac visited in early September and offered a different perspective. He did not mock, but he expressed concern. He said Mikhail was investing enormous labor in a project that had no proven benefit. He suggested Mikhail would be better served spending the time improving his farming operation or building a proper barn. Mikhail appreciated Stefan's tone, which was kind rather than contemptuous. But he continued working regardless of anyone's opinion. By October, with frost appearing on the grass most mornings, Mikhail had completed 3 walls to a height of 5 feet and the 4th wall to just 3 feet. The first snow came on October 15th, a light dusting that melted by midday but announced that serious cold was approaching. Mikhail worked faster, laying bricks in increasingly cold conditions. His hands became chapped and split from constant exposure to wet mortar. He wrapped them in cloth at night and continued working the next day. The 4th wall, the north wall that faced the prevailing wind, was the most critical, and it was the least complete. He made a final batch of bricks in late October, a rushed firing that produced inconsistent results, but gave him another 200 usable bricks. He built the north wall higher, pushing to complete it before weather made construction impossible. By early November, all 4 walls stood at least 5 feet tall. The structure looked strange and unfinished, with wooden roof and upper logs visible above brick walls that varied in height between 5 and 6 feet. It was not the complete enclosure he had envisioned, but it would have to suffice. The final construction task was sealing the top of the brick walls to the wooden structure. Mikhail mixed a thick mortar and packed it into the gap between the top course of bricks and the wooden logs above, creating a continuous seal around the perimeter. He could not brick over the roof, that was beyond his resources and time, but he could ensure that the walls themselves had no gaps where cold air could penetrate. He built a wooden door frame into the brick wall on the south side, positioning it to align with his existing plank door. The frame was crude but functional, and once the door was hung and gaps were sealed with mortar, it became part of the brick wall structure. The window received similar treatment, with brick courses built around the original opening and the frame sealed carefully. By mid-November, when temperatures began dropping consistently below freezing at night, the construction was complete. Mikhail's shack was now encased in the brick walls that rose 5 to 6 feet up from the ground. The upper portions of the log walls and the entire roof remained exposed, wood and sod, but the majority of the structure's surface area was now brick. It had taken 8 months of continuous work, thousands of pounds of clay, hundreds of hours of labor, and resources that could have been used for other purposes. Anton Kowalski rode past in late November and stopped to examine the finished work. He said it looked like someone had started building a brick house and given up halfway through. He asked what Mikhail thought those walls would accomplish. Mikhail said they would keep him alive through the winter. Anton laughed and said Mikhail would still freeze just like everyone else, only now he had wasted an entire summer building walls that served no purpose. He rode off shaking his head. Mikhail stacked firewood inside the shack and prepared for winter. He would know within weeks whether his work had been foolish or brilliant. The first truly cold night arrived on December 3, 1882. The temperature dropped to -15 degrees, cold enough to test any structure, but not yet the brutal extremes that would come in January and February. Mikhail built his evening fire as he always had, using the same amount of wood he had burned on similar nights the previous winter. He prepared a simple meal, ate, and banked the fire for the night around 9 o'clock. He lay down in his bedroll expecting the familiar pattern. The shack would grow cold within 2 hours. By midnight, he would be shivering despite multiple blankets. By morning, ice would have formed inside on any surface that held moisture. This had been his experience through the previous winter, the experience that had killed Jacob. He prepared himself for discomfort and poor sleep. But the cold did not come as expected. An hour after banking the fire, the interior temperature remained comfortable. Michael could feel warmth radiating from the brick walls nearest the fireplace. He placed his hand against the interior surface of the south wall and found it warm to the touch. The bricks had absorbed heat from the fire during the evening and were now releasing that heat back into the room. By midnight, when he would normally have been shivering, Michael was still comfortable enough to sleep without layering every blanket he owned. The fire had burned down to minimal coals, barely producing flame, yet the shack remained tolerably warm. The brick walls continued radiating stored heat, creating a stable temperature that bore no resemblance to the rapid heat loss he had experienced in the same structure the previous year. He woke several times during the night, each time expecting to find the familiar bone-deep cold that had characterized winter nights before. Each time the temperature remained steady. Cool, certainly, but not the desperate cold that made sleep impossible. When morning came and he rebuilt the fire, he realized he had slept better than any night since arriving in Dakota Territory. The exterior thermometer read -18 degrees. Inside the shack, Michael estimated the temperature had remained above 30 degrees throughout the night. That difference of nearly 50 degrees was maintained with minimal fuel. More importantly, it was maintained while he slept, without requiring him to wake and feed the fire every few hours. The brick walls had done exactly what Henry Cochran had explained they would do in that hotel dining room months earlier. Over the following week, Michael conducted a systematic comparison. He burned measured amounts of wood each day and tracked how long the shack maintained comfortable temperature. On nights when he built a strong fire before bed, the interior stayed warm enough that he needed only a single blanket through the night. On nights when he built a moderate fire, the temperature dropped more, but remained survivable without extreme measures. The brick walls had transformed his shack from a structure that barely kept him alive into genuine shelter. He recorded his observations in a small notebook, noting temperatures, fuel consumption, and his own comfort level. The data confirmed what he already knew from direct experience. The brick walls were working better than he had hoped, and winter had barely begun. Understanding why the brick walls worked required thinking about heat in ways Michael had not considered before his conversations with Henry Cochran. Heat was not simply warmth in the air. Heat was energy that could be stored in solid materials and released gradually over time. The denser and heavier the material, the more heat it could store. Brick was heavy and dense. Wood was light and porous. That fundamental difference explained everything. When Michael burned wood in his fireplace, the fire released heat energy into the shack. Before he built the brick walls, that heat had warmed only the air inside the structure. Air was a poor holder of heat. It warmed quickly, but held nothing. The moment the fire diminished, the warm air escaped through gaps in the walls, through the door and window frames, through the roof, and cold air replaced it from outside. The wooden walls themselves absorbed almost no heat. They remained at nearly the same temperature as the exterior air, regardless of how long the fire burned. The brick walls changed this completely. When the fire burned, the heat still warmed the air, but now it also warmed the brick. The thermal mass of roughly 3,000 bricks absorbed heat energy and stored it within the material itself. This process happened slowly. The bricks nearest the fireplace warmed first, then gradually the heat spread through the entire brick mass as the evening progressed. By the time Michael banked the fire for the night, the brick walls had absorbed significant heat energy. After the fire died down, the heat stored in the brick began releasing back into the room. The bricks cooled slowly, transferring their stored energy to the interior air. This release happened over many hours, 6 to 8 hours on cold nights, long enough to carry Mikhail through to morning without rebuilding the fire. The warmer the bricks became during the evening, the longer they continued radiating heat after the fire diminished. The effect was cumulative. On the first cold night, the bricks had not been particularly warm, because the previous days had been mild, and Mikhail had not been burning large fires. But as winter progressed and he maintained fires daily, the brick walls never fully cooled. Each day's fire warmed them again before they had completely released the previous day's stored heat. The thermal mass maintained a baseline temperature above freezing even on the coldest nights, creating a stable environment that bore no resemblance to the previous winter's deadly cold. The brick walls also eliminated another source of heat loss. The gaps between logs in the original shack walls had been chinked with clay and sod, but that chinking dried and cracked over time. Cold air infiltrated through these gaps constantly, creating drafts that carried away warm air. The brick walls, built tight against the wooden structure, sealed all those gaps completely. Even where the original chinking had failed, the brick provided a continuous barrier that stopped air infiltration. Mikhail understood now why the brick buildings in town required so little fuel. It was not that brick was naturally warmer than wood. It was that brick stored heat and released it slowly, turning every fire into hours of sustained warmth rather than brief comfort followed by cold. January 1883 brought the cold that killed unprepared homesteaders. Temperatures dropped below -20 degrees for days at a time. Blizzards rolled across the prairie with winds that made the air itself feel like a weapon. This was the cold that had killed Jakob exactly 1 year earlier, and Mikhail prepared himself to face it from inside walls he had built specifically for this test. On January 9th, the anniversary of the blizzard that had taken his brother, the temperature outside reached -32 degrees. Mikhail built a strong fire in the afternoon and maintained it through the evening. By the time he banked it at 9 o'clock, the brick walls were radiating heat he could feel from several feet away. The interior temperature was comfortable enough that he removed his outer coat, something he had never done during evening hours the previous winter. He slept through the night without waking from cold. When he rose at dawn, the fire was completely out, reduced to cold ash. The exterior temperature had dropped further overnight to -37 degrees. Yet inside the shack, Mikhail was not shivering. He rebuilt the fire wearing only 2 layers of clothing instead of the 4 or 5 he had required the previous year. The brick walls had maintained interior temperature above freezing throughout the night, despite exterior conditions that would have turned an unimproved shack into a death trap. He placed his exterior thermometer inside the shack for several hours to get an accurate reading of interior temperature. When he checked it, the thermometer read 28 degrees. Outside was -37. Inside was 28. The difference was 65 degrees, maintained by brick walls and residual heat from a fire that had been dead for 9 hours. Mikhail stood in his shack and thought about his brother dying in this same space 1 year earlier. The walls he had built would have saved Jakob's life. Over the following weeks, as January continued its assault, Mikhail refined his understanding of how much fire he needed to maintain comfort. On the coldest nights, he built strong fires and let them burn until late evening. On milder nights, moderate fires were sufficient. He learned that the brick walls performed better when kept consistently warm, rather than allowed to cool completely and then reheated. Maintaining baseline warmth took less fuel than repeatedly heating cold brick from scratch. His firewood consumption was dramatically lower than the previous winter. Mikhail estimated he was burning approximately 1/3 the wood he had used in January 1882. The difference was substantial enough that his woodpile, which he had worried might run short, would clearly last through the entire winter with surplus remaining. The brick walls had not only made survival comfortable, but had also reduced the labor required to gather fuel. Every hour not spent cutting and hauling firewood was an hour available for other necessary work. By the end of January, Mikhail knew his project had succeeded beyond his initial hopes. The question was no longer whether brick walls worked, but whether other homesteaders would believe it. Stefan Kovac arrived at Mikhail's shack on a February morning when the temperature outside was negative 21 degrees. He knocked on the door, and when Mikhail opened it, Stefan stepped inside and stopped immediately. He stood in the doorway staring at the interior, his expression shifting from confusion to surprise. He asked Mikhail if he had a fire burning. Mikhail pointed to the fireplace where a small fire burned, barely more than kindling. Stefan said that could not be the only fire because the shack was far too warm. Mikhail explained that he had built up a larger fire the previous evening and banked it around 10 o'clock. The current fire had been started just an hour earlier when he woke. Stefan walked to the brick wall and placed his hand against it. The brick was warm. He moved around the interior, touching different sections of wall, finding them all radiating heat. He asked how this was possible. Mikhail explained thermal mass and heat retention, the same concepts Henry Cochran had taught him months earlier. Stefan listened carefully, asked several questions about construction details, and then asked if he could bring Anton Kowalski to see this. Mikhail said Anton had already seen the walls and thought they were foolish. Stefan said Anton needed to see them working in winter, not just standing in summer. He left and returned 3 hours later with Anton and 2 other homesteaders Mikhail did not know well. All 4 men crowded into the shack. The small fire Mikhail had built that morning had burned down to coals, yet the interior was warm enough that the men unbuttoned their heavy coats within minutes. Anton walked directly to the fireplace and stared at the minimal coals as if suspecting Mikhail had hidden a second heat source. He examined the entire interior, looking behind Mikhail's belongings, checking corners, clearly searching for an explanation that did not involve the brick walls doing what Mikhail claimed they did. Finally, Anton placed his hand against the south wall brick and left it there for a long moment. He asked how warm the interior stayed overnight. Mikhail told him the temperature rarely dropped below 30 degrees even on the coldest nights. Anton asked how much wood he burned. Mikhail showed him his woodpile and explained he was using approximately 1/3 the fuel he had consumed the previous winter. Anton looked at Stefan, then back at Mikhail, and said he did not understand how this worked, but clearly it did work. One of the other homesteaders asked if Mikhail would help him build similar walls around his own cabin. Another asked how many bricks were required. Stefan asked about making bricks and where to find good clay. The conversation continued for an hour, with Mikhail answering questions about every aspect of construction, from clay preparation to firing to laying courses. He shared everything he had learned, holding back no techniques or information. When the men finally left, Mikhail stood in his doorway and watched them ride away across the frozen prairie. The walls that had brought mockery in summer were bringing questions in winter. Anton Kowalski returned alone 3 days later, carrying a thermometer identical to Mikhail's. He said he wanted to conduct a proper comparison. His own cabin was similar in size to Mikhail's shack, built the same year using the same general methods. If Mikhail's brick walls truly made the difference he claimed, then measuring both structures under identical conditions would prove it. Mikhail agreed to the test. They established a protocol. Both men would build fires of equal size using equal amounts of wood at the same time each evening. They would bank the fires at the same hour. They would record interior temperature at midnight, at 4 in the morning, and at dawn. They would conduct this test for 1 week during February's coldest stretch. Anton would keep his own records at his cabin, and Mikhail would keep records at his shack. At the end of the week, they would compare results. The week Anton selected was brutally cold. Temperatures ranged from -15 to -34 degrees. Both men built their fires each evening at 6 o'clock, burning identical quantities of split cottonwood. Both banked their fires at 9 o'clock. Both took temperature readings through the night at specified times. Mikhail slept comfortably. Anton, based on his appearance when he arrived each morning to compare notes, did not. The results were stark and undeniable. Anton's cabin interior temperature at midnight averaged 18 degrees. Mikhail's shack averaged 42 degrees. At 4 in the morning, Anton's cabin averaged 9 degrees. Mikhail's shack averaged 36 degrees. At dawn, Anton's cabin averaged 3 degrees. Mikhail's shack averaged 31 degrees. The difference between the two structures ranged from 24 to 28 degrees throughout the night, with Mikhail's shack consistently maintaining temperature more than 20 degrees warmer than Anton's cabin, despite using identical fuel. On the coldest night of the test week, when exterior temperature reached negative 34 degrees, Anton's cabin interior dropped to negative 2 degrees by dawn. Mikhail's shack remained at 29 degrees. The difference was 31 degrees, maintained by brick walls that had cost nothing but labor and time. Anton sat at Mikhail's small table studying the two sets of numbers, comparing them repeatedly as if hoping the mathematics would change. Finally, he said the difference was impossible to ignore and asked when Mikhail could help him start building brick walls around his own cabin. Mikhail explained that brickmaking could not begin until spring, when the ground thawed enough to dig clay. Construction could not proceed until summer, when temperatures allowed mortar to cure properly. If Anton began in April, he might have walls completed by October, in time for the next winter. Anton said he would begin the day ground conditions permitted. He asked if Stefan and the others who had visited would also be building walls. Mikhail said he expected several homesteaders would attempt it. Anton stood to leave, then turned back and said something Mikhail had not expected. He apologized for mocking the project. Word of the temperature measurements spread through the scattered homesteading community faster than Mikhail anticipated. By late February, he had received visits from 7 different men asking about brick wall construction. Some came from claims more than 10 miles away, distances that required significant travel effort in winter conditions. All of them asked similar questions about clay sources, brickmaking, firing techniques, and construction methods. Mikhail answered each question the same way he had answered Stefan and Anton, sharing everything he knew. In early March, Stefan Kovac proposed that several homesteaders work together on brickmaking rather than each man producing bricks individually. If they pooled labor and resources, they could fire larger batches more efficiently and produce enough bricks for multiple building projects. Stefan suggested they establish a common clay pit and firing ground at a central location where several men could work simultaneously. Mikhail thought this was sensible and agreed to help identify a good clay source. They selected a site along the same creek where Mikhail had found his clay, at a point roughly equidistant from the 4 homesteads planning construction projects. The clay seam was extensive enough to supply all their needs. They cleared an area for mixing and forming bricks and designated space for drying and firing. By late March, when the ground thawed enough to dig, 4 homesteaders were working the clay pit on a rotating schedule. The collaborative approach proved far more efficient than Mikhail's solitary work the previous year. With multiple men digging, hauling, mixing, and forming, brick production increased dramatically. They built larger firing piles that produced more consistent results. They shared techniques and solved problems collectively. By mid-May, they had produced more than 5,000 bricks, enough for at least 2 complete building projects, with surplus for others to begin. Anton started construction on his cabin walls in early June. Stefan began a week later. 2 other homesteaders, men named Joseph Dvorak and Henrik Lindgren, started in late June. Mikhail helped each of them lay their first courses, explaining the importance of level foundations and plumb walls. After that, each man worked independently on his own project, though they consulted with Mikhail when questions arose about technique. The summer of 1883 saw brick walls rising around homestead cabins across that section of Dakota Territory. Travelers passing through remarked on the strange construction. Some asked questions. Others simply shook their heads and continued on, probably thinking the homesteaders had lost their minds. But the men building the walls knew exactly what they were doing. They had spent a winter watching Mikkel sleep comfortably while they froze, and they were determined not to repeat that experience. The winter of 1883 to 1884 tested the brick walls built by multiple homesteaders, and the results validated everything Mikhail had claimed. Anton Kowalski's cabin, completed in early October with brick walls standing 6 feet high around the entire structure, maintained interior temperatures nearly identical to what Mikhail had achieved the previous year. Stefan Kovacs reported similar results. The two other homesteaders who had completed construction also experienced dramatic improvements in heat retention and fuel efficiency. The difference was measurable and undeniable. Men who had burned 4 or 5 cords of wood through previous winters now burned 1.5 cords for superior comfort. Families who had huddled in multiple layers of clothing through evening hours now moved about their cabins in normal indoor dress. Children who had previously been confined to beds under heavy blankets could play on cabin floors without risk of frostbite. The brick walls had not merely improved comfort, they had fundamentally changed what winter survival meant for homesteaders on the northern plains. Word continued spreading through the homesteading community. During the winter months, when travel was difficult, but neighbors still visited occasionally, every conversation eventually turned to cabin heating and brick wall construction. Men who had not witnessed the previous summer's building projects heard detailed accounts from those who had completed them. The temperature measurements Anton had conducted became widely known, repeated and verified by others who conducted their own comparisons between traditional cabins and brick-clad structures. By spring of 1884, at least 15 homesteaders were planning brick wall projects. The clay pit that had served 4 builders the previous year expanded to accommodate increased demand. More men meant more labor and faster production. The collaborative brick-making became a regular community activity, with homesteaders working together several days each week through late spring and summer. They produced thousands of bricks, enough to supply every planned project with surplus for future construction. The technique spread beyond immediate neighbors. Homesteaders from claims 10 and 15 miles away heard about the brick walls and traveled to see them. Some visited during winter specifically to feel the interior warmth and confirm the reports were accurate. Others came during summer to observe construction methods and ask technical questions. Mikhail found himself explaining thermal mass principles and bricklaying techniques to men he had never met, from areas of the territory he had never visited. The adoption pattern was not universal. Some homesteaders remained skeptical or simply lacked the time and energy to undertake such labor-intensive projects. Building brick walls required months of sustained work during the growing season, when other tasks competed for attention. Men with large families to feed or extensive farming operations often could not spare the time. But those who made the investment universally reported satisfaction with the results. No one who completed brick walls regretted the effort, and many wished they had started sooner. By autumn of 1884, the landscape of homestead construction in that region had changed visibly. A traveler riding through would see multiple cabins with brick walls rising around wooden structures, creating a distinctive architectural style that existed nowhere else on the frontier. The technique that had begun with Mikhail Novak's grief-driven obsession became standard practice for serious homesteaders in the northern Dakota Territory through the middle and late 1880s. As new settlers arrived to file claims, established homesteaders advised them to plan for brick wall construction as part of their second or third year improvements. The clay pit became a known landmark, referenced in directions and used as a meeting point. Brick-making became a communal activity that brought scattered homesteaders together regularly, creating social connections in addition to producing building materials. The method spread geographically as homesteaders moved or communicated with settlers in other areas. Men who had built brick-clad cabins in Dakota carried the knowledge with them when they relocated to Montana or Wyoming. Letters sent back to families in eastern states or in Europe sometimes mentioned the brick wall technique, describing it as a frontier innovation that made winter survival dramatically easier. Occasionally, newspapers in larger towns printed brief articles about the unusual construction method, though these articles often got the technical details wrong or treated the approach as a curiosity rather than a serious advancement. Professional builders in established towns began incorporating thermal mass principles into their designs after seeing the homesteaders' results. Some built entirely brick structures where materials permitted. Others designed thick-walled buildings that maximized heat retention. The understanding that mass, not just insulation, contributed to thermal performance gradually became more widespread among frontier construction professionals. The homesteaders had discovered through necessity what architects in eastern cities already knew but had not thought to apply to simple frontier cabins. By 1890, when the homestead rush in Dakota Territory was slowing as available land filled up, the brick-clad cabin design was common enough to have a name. People called them Novak cabins, after Mikhail, though he had never sought credit or tried to claim the innovation as his invention. He had simply solved a problem and shared the solution. Others had recognized the value and adopted it. The name stuck because people needed something to call the distinctive structures that dotted the landscape. The technique's long-term impact extended beyond the original builders. Cabins that received brick walls in the 1880s remained standing and functional into the early 1900s. When original homesteaders died or moved on, new inhabitants took over the claims and benefited from structures built decades earlier. The brick walls required minimal maintenance. Unlike wooden structures that rotted, shifted, and needed constant repair, the brick-clad cabins remained solid and weather-tight for 20 or 30 years with almost no intervention required. Modern estimates suggest the brick wall technique, spreading from Mikhail's original innovation, influenced construction on several hundred homesteads across Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming territories. The exact number is impossible to determine because most homestead construction went unrecorded, but references in letters, land office documents, and newspaper accounts indicate widespread adoption throughout the region during the 1880s and 90s. Mikhail Novak proved up on his homestead claim in 1886, fulfilling the 5-year residency requirement and gaining full ownership of his 160 acres. He continued farming the land through the 1890s, adding improvements each year as resources permitted. He built a proper barn in 1888 and expanded his cultivated acreage to 80 acres by 1890. He never married, living alone in the brick-clad shack that had started everything, though he expanded the structure twice to create additional living space. He maintained correspondence with his family in Prague, letters that took months to cross the Atlantic and reach Bohemia. In those letters, he wrote about farming and weather and the ordinary details of homestead life. He rarely mentioned the brick walls or their impact on frontier construction. To Mikhail, the innovation had been a practical solution to a specific problem, not an achievement worth highlighting. He had built walls that kept him warm, and other men had done the same. That seemed unremarkable from his perspective. Stefan Kovac remained a close friend through the years. They helped each other with harvest work and major construction projects. When Stefan's wife died in childbirth in 1891, Mikhail helped care for the 3 surviving children until Stefan's sister arrived from Minnesota to take over household management. The friendship forged through shared labor and mutual respect lasted until Stefan's death from pneumonia in 1903. Mikhail sold his homestead in 1906 at age 53. His health was declining, probably from decades of hard physical labor in harsh conditions, and he could no longer manage the farm alone. He moved to Yankton, the town where he had first studied brick buildings 25 years earlier, and lived in a boarding house near the river. He worked occasionally as a day laborer when his health permitted, but mostly he lived quietly on the proceeds from selling his land. He died in his sleep on March 14, 1912, at age 59. The boarding house owner found him in the morning. His few possessions were sold to cover burial expenses. He was interred in the Yankton Cemetery in an unmarked grave. No family attended the funeral because his relatives in Prague had lost contact with him years earlier and did not learn of his death until months later through a delayed letter. The brick-clad shack where Jakob had died and where Mikkel had survived stood on the homestead for another 30 years. The family that purchased the property in 1906 continued using the structure as their primary residence until 1928, when they built a larger frame house and converted the old cabin to equipment storage. The building still stood in 1940, weathered but solid, a testament to construction methods born from grief and desperation. Mikkel Novak left no written account of his innovation, no patents, no formal documentation. His legacy existed in physical structures scattered across the northern plains and in the knowledge passed between homesteaders who understood that survival sometimes required building something different than what everyone else built. He had proven that warmth was engineering, not luck, and that a determined man with clay and time could create shelter that defeated the coldest winter the frontier could deliver.